So over the last couple years, we made a bit of a tradition here on the channel where towards the beginning of October, I try to do it at the beginning so you guys have the entirety of Spooky Month to play through and enjoy these games. But, I like to make a video where I sit down and talk about roughly 5 games that you should play this Halloween, but once you include the honorable mentions, it's more like 10 games that you should really be playing during spooky season. But hey, whether it's spooky season or not, all of the games we'll be talking about are absolutely fantastic, and realistically, you could play them at any time of the year. It's just that there's certain elements to each of these games that we're gonna get to where I really feel like the experience could either be heightened or just kind of, help you slip into the spooky season mood just a bit more, just due to some of the elements and things in these games. But without further ado, we won't drag out the intro. Let's get into the first one on the list, that being Demon's Souls Remake. Now, I know at this point the game has been out for a little or almost 4 years at this point, but Demon's Souls is an absolutely timeless game. Whether you go back and play the PS3 original or whether you play the PS5 remake, this game is absolutely fantastic, and honestly, you can insert almost any Souls game on this list, maybe barring Sekiro, just, due to the fact that that's more of like a bright, colorful, samurai slashy type of game, whereas, the rest of the Souls games are more dark, depressing. Even something like Elden Ring, maybe Elden Ring to a lesser extent though, really like Dark Souls and Demon's Souls, they are perfect for Halloween time. There's probably gonna be somebody out there that's like, hey man, why aren't you talking about Bloodborne? And that's simply due to the fact that I already talked about Bloodborne either last year or the year before that. Whether you're traversing spooky castles or lava-ridden mines or all of the other creative areas like poison swamps, which are a staple in Souls games at this point, Demon's Souls remakes, between, the enemy variety, the boss designs, the atmosphere that the game gives off, even when you're just sitting in the Nexus, it is perfect for spooky season. So honestly, if you haven't played Demon's Souls Remake at this point, it is available on PS Plus Extra if you have that subscription. Otherwise, I'm sure you can pick up a copy for relatively cheap on eBay or one of the other secondhand sites, and I highly recommend that you do so. This is a fantastic remake of the original game. But again, if you don't have the remake and you only have a PS3 and that original copy, go back and replay Demon's Souls again, because regardless of which version you play, Demon's Souls is an absolutely fantastic game, and it's perfect for spooky season. Next up, we have one game, which is actually technically 2 games, because the only way that it's officially available nowadays is through the collection, but honestly, both games are equally fantastic, despite the fact that they are 2 very different takes on the same series. So that would be the Amnesia Collection, aka Amnesia: The Dark Descent, as well as its DLC, as well as Amnesia: A Machine for Pigs. Now, don't worry, if you buy the Amnesia Collection, it will come with the aforementioned DLC, just, included with the game. But basically, Amnesia: The Dark Descent is more of like a first-person survival horror semi-management type of game where, you're going to be traversing through this castle and later on different locations throughout the game. It's sort of like a classic Resident Evil game, but sort of like in first person. You're going to be, grabbing certain pieces to solve certain puzzles. You'll be backtracking, going through the environments, sometimes running away from certain enemies, sometimes solving puzzles and solving environmental puzzles in order to get away from certain enemies and such. And, the interesting about all of this is because even though it could kind of be considered a survival horror or management game in a way, there's actually not really any combat in the game, not directly anyway, outside of the puzzle solving. So you're completely defenseless throughout the game, which really adds to the tenseness in the atmosphere and just how intense the game feels in general. And then you have a game like A Machine for Pigs, which is definitely less on that, like survival horror-ish management puzzle backtracking type of thing, and it's more or less I don't necessarily want to call it a walking sim, because it's not necessarily a walking sim, but it is more or less a game that you play for the experience. If you guys have played games like Grease before, I think that's how you pronounce it, the game where, you play as the girl that's going through, all the different 5 stages of grief. That game is absolutely beautiful, by the way. I highly recommend it if you've never played it before, but it's very similar to that, where you're basically going to be playing through the game, and there's no way you can lose the game, really. You know what I mean? Like, sure, there is points where you can technically reach a fail state, or you might, have difficulty with certain puzzles here and there. I don't think you would or should, especially if you're able to get through the Dark Descent, which I would recommend playing the Dark Descent first, just because that was the first game in the series. Then again, A Machine for Pigs and Dark Descent aren't really connected, so you could play either one, but I'm the type of guy I just like to play series in order, if you know what I mean. But yeah, A Machine for Pigs, it would definitely be a bit easier probably for you to get into if you find yourself struggling with the Dark Descent, but A Machine for Pigs, it's still, it's just absolutely crazy when it comes to the horror factor, and in some ways I would say that it's even more terrifying, depressing, and just, visceral and perfect for the spooky season time. But really, you can't go wrong with either game. They're both great for spooky season. So if you're going to pick up one, well, you don't have a choice. If you're picking up one, you're picking up the other, just because the only way to get this game or these games would be through the Amnesia Collection. So once you play these, also make sure to try out some of the later entries in the series, those being Rebirth and The Bunker, the latter of which being absolutely terrifying. And then Rebirth, that one's definitely a bit less terrifying. It's still terrifying, and there's still a lot of horror elements in it, but The Bunker will literally give you a heart attack. So yeah, check out the Amnesia series if you have not before. Next up, we got a bit of a little fun and quirky one, just because I always like to throw in at least one of these games. Last year, I threw in Costume Quest and Costume Quest 2. This year, we're gonna look at Medieval. I've never been sure how you're exactly supposed to pronounce the name, since it's spelled a little bit differently than the actual word. But basically, this is a classic 3D action platformer of sorts from the PS1 era. It also got a sequel during the PS1 era, but it also got a remake on PlayStation 4, which means whether you have a PS4 or a PS5, obviously with the PS5 being backwards compatible, you can play the remake there as well. And honestly, there is no wrong way to play the game. The remake is literally 1-to-1 with the original, the only difference being the different and more modernized, revised graphics. Otherwise, the art style is the exact same, and the graphics themselves are essentially the exact same. They're just obviously more modern, more polygons and such. If you've played one of these, classic 3D action platformers from back in the day, whether it's on the PS1 or the PS2 or the GameCube or whatever, you know what you're getting into here. And if you don't know what you're getting into, well, then that just means you've been missing out. So definitely give this game a shot, whether you play the original version or the one on PS4. It is a very fun time. It is not a long game. You can easily knock it out in a day or two over the course of a weekend at most. You'll be traversing all sorts of dark and spooky environments, encountering witches and fighting zombies and the undead and such. And then once you get up to the final battle, man, it's just... it's all out chaos. I absolutely adore Medieval, and I have a ton of nostalgia for this game, so definitely make sure to check it out this Halloween if you've never played it before. And even if you have played it before, you might as well replay it. It's a fantastic game, and I really hope that the second game can also get the remake or port treatment at some point in the future. Next up, we have a game that I feel is super underrated, and the only reason it was ever hated on is simply because the internet is a sickening echo chamber that I cannot stand. Conversation for another day. I won't go any deeper into that, but that being the Callisto Protocol. This is essentially, well, it was essentially going to be the next generation of Dead Space of sorts, you could say, until Dead Space Remake happened, and then we, I got the actual next generation of Dead Space, if you want to put it that way. But, man, the Callisto Protocol, let me tell you something. The Callisto Protocol is an absolutely fantastic game between the characters, the story, the set pieces you'll be going through, the level design, the combat, the atmosphere and the tone, the lore, the voice acting and the acting and animation in general. This game is so immersive. I played this game with my surround sounds on, and let me tell you something, man, with that combat, when you're like dodging left and right and you're swinging with that baton and you're like, ripping chunks of these enemies off and bits are flying everywhere. Once you start getting into the shooting bits later in the game, it is so satisfying. Every time you pull off those dodges, or when you're fighting like multiple enemies in a hallway and you're like backing up trying to figure out like who to take on next, and then again every time that you swing, and then when you start kind of improving your skills later on and you find out like when is it time to use the light attacks, when's it best to use the heavy attacks, almost like a Souls game in a way. I'm not saying that the Callisto Protocol is a Souls game, because of course it's not, and it's nowhere near as difficult as that. Not to mention just how intense and exciting some of these boss battles can get, especially towards the end with that final boss battle. Oh my goodness, there is so much tenseness there, and then you also have the DLC that you can go through if you so desire. It goes on sale quite often, so you might as well pick it up if you do decide to get the game. And let me just say, the Callisto Protocol, I don't know what the song is called, but the music that plays during the credits is one of my favorite credit songs of like, just in terms of setting the tone after you beat the game, right? Because I feel like credit songs are such a overlooked part of video games in general. Like, once you beat a game and once you see the credits start to roll, just seeing the credits in the first place invokes a certain emotion, but the music that accompanies those credits it just takes it to a whole other level. Like when you beat Resident Evil 4, it's a bittersweet feeling of like, oh yes, I did it, but now it's over. So now you feel accomplished that you beat the game, but you also feel sad all at the same time. And then you beat a game like, oh, I don't know, Modern Warfare 3, and then you have like Revenge playing by 21 Savage, and it's like, even though I don't like 21 Savage personally, I don't enjoy his music. Nothing against him as a person, just don't enjoy his music. But still hearing that in the background while the credits are rolling, it still sets that tone of like, man, I just played through like a pretty rad action movie. I don't care what anybody says. I enjoyed MW3 2023's campaign, just, turning your brain off, having fun with the story, shooting a bunch of dudes, having a good time. And yeah, man, the Callisto Protocol is definitely one of those games where you beat it and you're sitting there just watching the credits roll with the, with the music going. It's like, man, What a game. What a game, man. I love the Callisto Protocol. Absolutely excellent. Next up, we have 5 honorable mentions. So like I said, this is technically like a 5 games list you should play, you know, during spooky season, but there's 5 extras, so it's technically 10 games, so there you go. But anyway, the first one I wanted to go ahead and mention is Five Nights at Freddy's Into the Pit. This is actually the most recent Five Nights at Freddy's game, just released a little bit ago, and this game is a lot of fun. Granted, it's not the longest game in the world, but not every game needs to be some 500-hour adventure, right? Some games, you know, if you're able to just beat it in a sitting or so, something like, you know, Little Nightmares, for example, or something like this, where it's just a few hours long, sometimes that's all you need for a game. And this, essentially, I don't know how to describe this game and really talk about it without spoiling it, just because there's been so many FNAF games at this point, and there's so much lore to go over, and if I start to talk about some things and who the villains and animatronics are in this game, it could spoil certain things from other games if you haven't played the FNAF games before, if you're looking to get into the lore. So what I'm going to say is that this is a very different take on your typical FNAF game. We've seen some like Security Breach, which are more like the first person perspective, or Help Wanted, you know, with the VR stuff, or, you know, like the first couple of games with like 1 through 4 and Sister Location and such. But this is more of like a retro inspired, at least as far as the art style is concerned, you know, a bit of a, I guess like 16-ish looking bit art style to it. And it's a bit more of like a 2D puzzle. Man, how do I describe? Because I really don't want to spoil anything about this game. There's some puzzles involved. It's a 2D game, and there's almost Resident Evil vibes to it, where you're going to be running for your life, and you get to the door at the last second as an animatronic is behind you. You know what I mean? Again, I'm really trying to be careful because now the lore is getting so crazy, and we obviously had the movie, which I really enjoy the movie. I'm a huge FNAF fan, by the way. I don't know how many people know that, but I'm one of those guys where even though I never talk about it, I sit there watching FNAF lore videos like it's my second job some days. I've always just found it so interesting how the game seems so simple on its surface, but there's so much to it with all the different characters and such, whether it's characters you interact with firsthand in the game, or once you start getting into the deeper bits where there's like other players going on behind the scenes, which I'm really glad that the movie actually delved into some of those lore bits and elements and such. But again, also considering that the game is relatively short, I don't want to say too much just so I don't spoil the experience for you. So go into it as blind as you can, just because it had me on the edge of my seat. Next up, this one is pretty straightforward. This is Dead Nation. This is a twin-stick shooter that is available on the PS3, PS Vita, and PS4. You can't go wrong playing it on any system. I do believe that this is unfortunately one of the games that does have some issues when you try to play it backwards compatibly on PS5, at least it used to. They may have fixed that by now. I hope that is the case, because I really do hope that everybody possible is able to play this game, because it is a super underrated gem. If you've never played a twin-stick shooter before, then, well, you're simply missing out, and you definitely need to give this game a chance. It's you know, you move with the left stick, you aim with the right stick, and then you push the trigger to shoot. And you know, I'm a sucker for games like this. I've talked about it before. Games like Dead Nation, Alienation, just twin stick shooters in general, absolutely love and adore them. So check this game out if you have the chance. It is a lot of fun, and once again, it's not too long. You can easily beat it in a day or so. Next up, we have Pumpkin Jack, and I'm not going to talk too long about this one because it's relatively similar to Medieval, which was already on the list earlier. But similar to that, you know, 3D action platformer. You're going to be playing as the main man, Pumpkin Jack. If I remember hearing correctly, this game was also only developed by one person, which is very impressive. Much like a lot of the other games on the list, this one also is not too long. Could easily knock it out in a day or so, and I have seen it on sale a number of times. But it is a very fun game and definitely worth checking out and trying if you haven't played it before. And once again, even if you have played it before, it's spooky season. Might as well give it another go. The next game I was considering putting on the list, and then I was like, is this really spooky season? And then I was like, yeah, you know what? I feel like this one does kind of fit the whole spooky season theme. That being Bloodstained Curse of the Moon. Now, obviously, there's also a sequel to this, so if you end up enjoying the first one, you could go on to play the second one, which I would also highly recommend. But Bloodstained Curse of the Moon is essentially a prequel game to Bloodstained Ritual of the Night. But Ritual of the Night, you know, it's a bit of a longer game, and it does go for a bit of a different art style. Whereas with Curse of the Moon, I wanted to highlight this one specifically just because I feel like that classic NES Castlevania 8-bit style really does harken to, it just really does lean into the spooky side of things. I don't know what it is, it's just the lower bit aesthetic just feels even spookier and creepier to me. You know, again, is this game necessarily trying to be a horror game? No, but similar to other games on this list, it really does just lean into the spooky atmosphere or the unsettling vibes at the very least. If you're unfamiliar with Castlevania games, which is a spiritual successor to created by some of the original creators of the Castlevania games, essentially, you know, you're going to be going through the levels, and, you know, if you've ever heard the term Metroidvania before, half of the term Metroidvania, the Vania part, comes from Castlevania. You'll be going through the levels, you'll definitely want to do a good bit of exploring. Unlike Metroid, where there's a lot of backtracking, there's not as much backtracking here in Bloodstained: Curse of the Moon, but you're still going to be picking up different abilities for your characters, different weapons you can use against certain bosses. Certain bosses will be weak to certain elements, whereas other ones will be different. You know, like for example, there's also different uses that characters have. Like I can think towards the end of the game, there's this one part where normal characters aren't necessarily able to jump across certain gaps in order to get certain power-ups, but the one character is able to turn into a bat, and then you can, you know, fly as that bat and go get those abilities and such. Don't worry, that's not too much of a spoiler because you do end up finding out about that ability relatively early on in the game, and then there's like other modes you can go through. You know, you can play the game once and get to the credits and have that be it, or you can go back through and experience like another version of the story and sorts, and there's a bunch of other things to go for, so there's a lot of surprising depth there beyond even that first playthrough. And you also have to consider the fact that this game constantly goes on sale for like maybe $5, if not less. It's a very cheap game. It's not the longest game in the world, but you can get a lot of replayability out of it, especially if you go back in, dive into the different story elements, try to dive into the lore a bit more, do the different challenge modes that they have built into the game, and, you know, mess with all the different abilities and such. Again, a lot of a surprising amount of depth and replayability in a game that seems simple enough on its surface, at least when you go through it for the first time. I'd highly recommend giving this game and its sequel, Bloodstained: Curse of the Moon 2, a chance, and even Ritual of the Night if you get to that one. Again, that one feels less spooky in my opinion than the Curse of the Moon games, but it's still an absolutely fantastic game, and again, does harken back to those classic days of Castlevania if you've ever played this before. And if even not, if you've just been considering getting into the Castlevania games, or if you never maybe even, you know, played a Castlevania game or even thought about playing one before, I mean, Bloodstained: Ritual of the Night would be a good way to kind of get your toes wet, you know, kind of dip your feet in the water and get into the genre. And then finally, for the honorable mentions, we have Guns, Gore, and Cannoli. In this game, it's sort of like a 2D shooter of sorts. You're going to be shooting some mob enemies, and you're also going to be shooting a bunch of zombies, and I will say, depending on the difficulty you choose, it can become pretty challenging by the end. If you just play it on the normal difficulty, you'll still probably be relatively challenged enough, but you know, if you're familiar with games like this, or if you play games like Contra before, which I'm not comparing this to Contra by any means, Contra on like the NES, for example, is definitely more difficult than this game, but just that style of like 2D shooter with some platforming and such, then you should at least kind of have an idea as to what you're getting yourself into here. And if you play on the normal difficulty, again, it will require some skill, and if you try to dial it up a bit, I promise you, you will have one heck of a time by the end just because of how many enemies get thrown on screen. It's never BS or unfair, by the way, either. Like, you know, I went through the game on normal difficulty. I did die like a handful of times, but I wasn't too challenged overall just because, you know, I've played games like this before, right? Whether it be the original Contra or Contra 3 on the SNES. The game is a lot of fun. There's a lot of different weapons you can mess with too. You know, you got like rocket launchers and Tommy guns, and if you haven't been able to tell, this obviously it takes place during like, you know, like the Mafia times, and there's a lot of references to like the Mob and Godfather and stuff like that. Me, a huge fan of the Godfather, whether we're talking the movies or like the games from back in the day, I absolutely adore the Godfather, so anytime that they threw out one of those references, I caught on immediately, and it got a great laugh out of me. I can highly recommend this game and its sequel, Guns, Gore, and Cannoli 2. They're a ton of fun, they have a lot of charm, and they're perfect for spooky season. And finally, we have one where you're gonna look at it and you're gonna be like, Grotesque, what are you talking about? And that's the thing, I can't tell you what I'm talking about. You're gonna see it, you're gonna be like, what? And that, it's just, it's unfortunate that I can't say more about this, but Doki Doki Literature Club. I mean, yeah, you know, there's a trailer on your screen right now, you're looking at it, you're like, what in the world, why are you recommending this for spooky season? And I cannot tell you. And people in the comments, if you've played the game before, please don't spoil it. And, you know, if you're curious, don't look up gameplay about it. The best way to go into the game is knowing absolutely nothing, because the minute that you search anything on Google, Reddit, X, YouTube, you're gonna see spoilers, and it's not necessarily gonna ruin the game for you, because most of the spoilers you'd probably run into, just because when you play the game for the first time, you're probably going to encounter one specific ending, which is just, it's... Again, I can't say anything, but then after that first ending, which basically everybody gets the same ending the first time, once you go back through, then that's where things differentiate depending on the choices you've made and the choices you're about to make. And again, there's not a whole lot I can say about the game, unfortunately, but I will say that it takes some unexpected twists and turns, and yeah, I think it gave me PTSD. Let me just put it this way. I've been single for 5 years at this point, and that's entirely by choice. You know, I'm not ready for a relationship. That's not something that I'm actively looking for at this time. And playing Doki Doki Literature Club is one of those games where every time that I replay it or simply think about it, it strengthens that feeling or just that notion in my mind that, yeah, you know what, being single, That's the best way to live. Also, let me just say this. I know most people probably pronounce her name Yuri just because that's how it looks to be spelled in English, but I'm pretty sure the names are supposed to be Japanese, so the name would actually be pronounced Yuri. If I had to pick my favorite girl from the game, it would definitely be Yuri, and I don't know if that says anything about me as a person, but yeah, I simp for Yuri. What can I say? Anyways, that is 5, technically 10 games that you should check out during spooky season. So, yeah, get to playing, and I'll see you guys back here next October. Don't forget, I do post videos every day, so don't just, like, think that I'm saying this is the last video until next October. No, I'm just saying, like, I'll see you guys back here for another list next October, but, like, please don't leave me for, like, a whole year. I do still post videos every day. Don't leave. But, anyway, as always, massive shout out to all the Patrons and channel members. Thank you to all you in the low baller tier, and shout out there on the mid baller tier, middle asking, epic animated, and big shout out on D tier, run events on the G-School. Thank you guys so much. You guys are literal legends. I love you. Have an amazing day. Stay beautiful. I love you all. Peace.